Okay, so I want to use this video to talk about how the USSR ultimately collapsed in 1991. So first, for some background information, apologies for the lame pun, but this is just a Beatles reference. In any event, the USSR was in some serious trouble by about the mid-1980s, and so this is just a brief laundry list of some of the problems that were taking place. So relatively briefly, first of all, their economy was in a terrible position. One of the biggest reasons why that was because the Soviet Union was focusing its production mainly on industrial and uh, essentially urban production, and they weren't making enough food to feed their citizens. So that meant that they had to outsource their food. They had to actually bring food in from other countries to feed their citizens, and there still wasn't enough. And so this image is showing some people actually waiting in line to get bread, and clearly there's not enough for all of the people that you see here in the background. Another major problem, again associated with the emphasis on industrial production in the Soviet Union, was that there was a lot of pollution. And one of the best examples of that was the Aral Sea, which actually literally started to disappear throughout the 1980s. Also, you may know of the Chernobyl disaster. It was a nuclear meltdown that took place in what is now Ukraine. And the entire city that the plant was in ultimately was evacuated, and it's still full of radiation to this day. So these pollution problems were attempted. They were hidden to a certain extent. Gorbachev did not want to admit what actually happened in Chernobyl, but ultimately the information leaked out. The government was in a really bad position. Partially just due to a lot of corruption. A lot of people who had worked for the government for decades ultimately took advantage of their high-powered positions. And when this says milking their government jobs, essentially what we're seeing is that they sort of use their high-powered position to their advantage in a very corrupt way. There was a huge desire for religious freedom throughout the Soviet Union. Many religious people, particularly Christians and Muslims, wanted to express their religion freely. So Poland, which was a Catholic state, and a nation like, let's say, Kazakhstan, for example, which has many more Muslims in it, they ultimately wanted to be able to have freedom of expression, and they weren't able to. And then lastly, a lot of the client states ultimately became much more nationalistic and wanted to be free. Some of them actually were part of the Soviet Union. Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Lithuania were all parts. I can show you on a map moving forward just for a second. We're all parts of the former Soviet Union. Let me go here so you can see some of them here. There's Georgia, for example. And they ultimately do gain their independence because of their desire to break free from the Soviet Union. So when Mikhail Gorbachev took over the Communist Party in the 1980s, he attempted to save it by introducing these two new reforms. The first one is Glasnost, and the second one is Perestroika. So let's dig a little bit more deeply into those. These videos are good to watch on your own. They show what it was like before and after Glasnost. But let's really focus on Glasnost itself. So Glasnost means openness. Ultimately, it was really an opening of ideas in the Soviet Union for the first time really since Khrushchev. And so these categories really speak for themselves, but let's just make sure that they're fully understood, right? So for the first time since de-Stalinization, the Soviet people were allowed to speak freely, and they were also allowed to vote in free, open elections. And when I say free open elections, there were elections prior to this, but they were single candidate elections. You could vote for literally one person. These new elections, there were multiple candidates to choose from, so it was much more reminiscent of a democracy. There was also open communication for the first time, again, since Khrushchev, right? So you could actually, if you had relatives that lived in another country, you could call them, you could write to them, and you could also visit them, right? And that was a huge difference. Another thing that sort of reminded me of de-Stalinization was, for the first time again since Khrushchev, people could speak out against Stalin and his war crimes. That did not happen under Brezhnev. And lastly, people could speak out against the government, right? And this was really problematic because a lot of people started to speak out against Gorbachev himself. I can talk a little bit more about why it was more successful than Perestroika. really, the cheap answer is that people liked it more. People liked the fact that they could buy blue jeans or buy chewing gum or buy a Michael Jackson album, right? These things were unknown to Russians prior to Glasnost. Perestroika was met with mixed results. Perestroika was an economic restructuring plan. And so what that meant was, really, it was introducing some facets of capitalism into the Soviet economy. One of the most prominent examples was opening private businesses into the Soviet Union. And many of these businesses were foreign businesses. So this is one of the most famous examples. McDonald's opened its first restaurant in Moscow on New Year's Eve in 1990. So it was an American corporation doing business in the Soviet Union. And you can tell by the lines, it was clearly popular, at least at the time. In addition, they decentralized the control over the economy. So essentially what that meant was the independent republics within the Soviet Union had more control over the economy. Decentralization essentially means, sort of spreading out control. Sort of like if we had a more decentralized government, then states would have more power, right, as opposed to the federal government. They also opened up more foreign trade. So again, that kind of overlaps with Glasnost because you could buy products that were made in other countries. But still, it's more of an economic policy. And then another huge one was that they stopped spending so much money on their military, which was one of the major reasons why many states surrounding the Soviet Union no longer felt the need to maintain membership in their sphere of influence. This had a lot of bad effects, right? Since the government no longer controlled prices because of supply and demand, many prices went way up, and many average Soviets could no longer afford to buy things. Also, there, again, was not enough food. And this led to even longer lines, and many types of food were actually rationed. So you get sort of like a card where you could only buy so many of a certain product in a week, let's say. So things like bread were in limited supply. And then one of the other major negative effects of the decentralized economy was that the government was less efficient when it came to collecting taxes, and the Soviet Union brought itself into a lot of debt. Okay, foreign policy, another really, really important thing. Even though this slide doesn't have much text on it, I think the maps actually really speak for themselves. So remember the Brezhnev Doctrine, right? The idea that if any country was thinking about breaking free from socialism, that Brezhnev articulated it was okay for the Soviet Union to use force, especially military force, to intervene. The My Way Doctrine was almost the opposite of that. It was called the My Way Doctrine after a Frank Sinatra song called My Way. And what Gorbachev said was that essentially you could choose whatever future path you wanted to, whether you were communist or not. And so the My Way Doctrine is almost a complete break from the Brezhnev Doctrine. And that too led to the end of the USSR, because after that, many states either declared their independence. Here are some states in the Baltic region that gain their independence. And then other client states end up revolting against Soviet influence. And one of the best examples of that is that East Germany ends up essentially denouncing Soviet leadership. And after that, the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989. And I recommend you watch this video on your own because it's really, really meaningful. And let's see, last slide here. What happened next? Shortly before the Soviet Union dissolved, it broke up into 15 different republics. And the Russian Federation, aka Russia, was the largest. They had their first free democratic election ever. So Russia is over 1,000 years old at this point. For the first time ever, they vote freely for presidents. Boris Yeltsin, he's hard to see here, but it's this guy here, was elected as the president of Russia. Okay? And he ultimately stands up against the Communist Party. He calls out the party for being corrupt. He leaves the party. And Gorbachev, meanwhile, is still the head of the Soviet Union. Remember, he's president of just Russia. This is the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev is still in control of that. And Yeltsin demands that he resigns. And in the meantime, a bunch of hardliner communists, what that means is they were communists who wanted to really toe the line. They were like Stalin communists they try to stage a coup, which means an overthrow of the state. They storm tanks down the streets of Moscow, but Yeltsin, if you can see in this picture, he's actually standing. There's the barrel of a gun on the tank. Yeltsin's standing on top of the tank. Here's the Russian flag waving, and he's basically stopping the coup. So Yeltsin sort of emerged as a hero as a result of this. And shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union peacefully dissolved. Okay, now what came after was a little complicated. The Soviet Union had a lot of Russia, not the Soviet Union. Soviet Union's gone by 91. Russia had a lot of economic problems, but for the quiz and the test, you don't have to worry about those. Okay, so another interesting video to watch is the very last time the Soviet flag goes down, but I'll leave that to you. The last thing that I'd like you to just check out really quickly is the cartoon that we looked at the beginning of class, because there are some cartoon-based questions. There's at least one on the test. So I don't really want to talk about it too much. I want you to interpret it on your own. But as you can see, Glasnost is depicted as a baby here, right? Remember that Glasnost meant openness, right? Gorbachev is holding the baby, and look at the caption. So essentially, think about what it would be like to have a really unruly child. How much control are you gonna have on that child once the child gets older, right? So kind of take that and interpret what the outcome of Glasnost is, and that's the meaning of the cartoon. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. Hopefully I'll have time later this weekend to do a video on the Brezhnev Doctrine and some of the things on Quiz 2. And if I make that, I'll make sure to send that along. All right, thanks for watching.